Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital and manufacturing. In this third and final episode in our three-part series on the components of a PLM system, Jonathan and Jen cover deeper topics such as project management, program management, systems engineering, variant management, and compliance and regulatory requirements, as well as e-signature and intellectual property protection, process definition, work instructions, and other finer points in PLM systems. If you listen to all three podcasts, you have officially graduated from our mini PLM course. Let's tune in with Jonathan and Jen.
Welcome back, everybody, to Stay Sharp, the podcast where we talk about all things digital related to products and manufacturing. And it is our third episode in a row on talking about the components of PLM systems. I'm joined with my colleague, Jonathan Scott.
Hey, everybody.
Who is doubling as our PLM expert for the third time here.
We're trying.
And I want to welcome everybody back, because if you're back for the third episode, you really are into this. So you're our kind of people.
Gold star.
We're happy to have you back. Jonathan, why don't you kick us off by just going through a little bit of what we're talking about? Just set the context again, just in case this is the first time somebody's come in.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, if you are sticking with us after all three episodes, you should let us know, because we need to know who else is the special kind of weird, right, that wants to talk about this much. So
yeah, we might give special gifts. You never know.
Yeah, you never know. You never know. So, right, Jen, what have we been talking about? What are we talking about? We've done some episodes on like what is PLM, PDM versus PLM, that kind of thing. But at this point, we really wanted to dig into the components of a PLM system, and framing that. We talked a little bit at the beginning about what is PLM, right? And it's managing a product through its life cycle, product lifecycle management. So it's an approach to how people make things, how people make products, and that's what PLM is. But really, here we're on these episodes, we're trying to dig into what are the components of the PLM systems that help people do PLM, right? So I think that's just level setting. We're talking about different areas of PLM systems, and not necessarily, any one PLM system from a certain vendor and what it does, but collectively out in the market today, what do PLM systems do, right? And trying to dig into those areas.
Right. And in the first episode, we talked a lot about PLM in general, and we touched on the 5 most common areas of a PLM system. Last episode, we went through and we talked in greater depth in those particular areas, sort of lesser known capabilities in those 5 primary areas. Those were platform capabilities, file management, product-related structure management, collaboration was a big one. And this time we're going to process management. All right, thank you for catching that.
Yep.
And then this time we're going to dig into some of the lesser known capabilities, things like, or more specific, project management, which is different than process management, systems engineering or product architecture, some of the details on variant management or product line engineering, compliance and regulatory, as well as process planning, which is also different than process management. And if we have time, maybe a little bit of ALM. So
right, and the software side of things.
Yeah. So let's dig in a bit then. Where do we want to start?
I think I used a term last time we were last episode, that maybe fringier areas, more specialized areas. Something.
We're just trying to sound cool. We're just trying to sound.
I try. But yeah, let's dig into those. I mean, I think that's a good place on this episode. There's a lot of fun stuff to talk about, and maybe I'll take it from the top when you're starting that list of the other areas that we want to dig into. I think project management is the first one. So what's project management? Well, I think this can look very different depending on how the PLM system might approach it. And you can kind of approach it from a bunch of different levels, maybe is the right way to think about this one. So let me just start at, I think, the most common way that some PLM systems are doing project management. Maybe I'll back up first. What is project management? I think it's like process management, but less well-defined. So process management it's a standard set of steps that you go through, and you kind of know who does what.
Right.
And it's repeatable. like standard operating procedure inside your company. We do this when we do a design review. We do that when we do an engineering change. Project management, I think, is more fluid. It's more ad hoc. It's different every time. Maybe you could still templatize it a little bit. I'm not saying you don't do that. So
you still
maybe
have
it's
the
like
same broad categories, but
right.
It's gonna be specific to a particular project.
Right. And so that's why I think this is worth its own kind of category of PLM functionality. And so if we do dig into what's most common there when people think of project management, I think a lot of folks think of managing tasks and linking those tasks together so that when this task is done, I can move on to that task. So predecessor, successor kind of relationships, and they also think about assignments to tasks. So far I'm sounding a lot like process management, but again, maybe it's not always coming from a template. So you're doing a new project, you want to define the tasks, how they're related, who's assigned to which task, and then maybe schedules and dates. When do I need to have it done by? An estimate for how long that task is going to take. Things that help you build out a project plan. And mentally, if you're like me, you're immediately sort of getting this image of a Gantt chart in your head. Oh yeah, tasks and assignments and dates and schedules and things like that. So I think that's what I mean. That's one, it's kind of the main functionality inside of this broader project management. And here's the tough part. I don't know what to call this one to differentiate it from the main category. It's like basic project management, schedules and tasks and things like that. So anyway, you might...
It's kind of like when we were talking about platform capabilities, right? There was a specific area of like all platforms, regardless of what the kind of platform they are, do these things. So all process management does this, project management.
Yeah. But I mean, I think it's, not to confuse our process and project terms, but inside of that broad category project management, there is a basic project management functionality we're talking about. And I'll add one more thing to it that I think makes it unique when you're doing it inside of the context of a PLM system, that maybe differentiates it from project management that is outside of PLM. And that's connecting it to the other PLM stuff. So a lot of these tools, when they give you basic project management, they let the tasks link to other things in the system, like deliverables or processes, or, so what I mean by deliverables, like, so you link a task to a document and say, all right, that task, when that task is complete, that document needs to be finished. Or maybe they even automate something where it's like, when you release the document, the task is done. Stuff like that, right? That kind of example. But that's, I think, in this basic project management category, that's the kind of thing that we mean.
Okay, then beyond project, matter of fact, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, would another term for project management be program management?
It's a great question.
I mean, along the lines of like automotive or aerospace, where you've got different programs, are those one and the same?
I don't think they are. I think they're a little different. And I think that's another good functionality to talk about inside of this broader category. So, let's say the one we just talked about, basic project management, is running a project with a set of tasks and people and deliverables and that kind of thing. When you collect up several of them, you put them together, right? And you say, well, I might, inside a particular program that's a larger thing, have multiple projects, right? Okay. So I might have a project that's running to study the market, and then I'd have another project that's related to designing this product or the prototype, and another one that's industrializing the prototype into a product. And then I've got another one that's planning out the service offerings for it. Those all might be independent projects that maybe they have linked timelines, maybe they don't, but they all come together for this program. Or another way of aggregating might be, I'm doing a bunch of different projects for my OEM that I sell to, right? So these are all of the projects for GM, for Ford, for Boeing, for whoever it is, and I put them together as a program. And I think it's a different area of functionality. You want to look at different things. It's like a different level of governance sometimes inside the organization. So you want to bubble up maybe information from basic project management to a higher level to do program management. You want a bigger picture maybe, and there might be some other things that you look at. So I think program management's a little different. And again, some tools offer it, some tools don't. They just do the basic project management piece.
Right. It'd be interesting to know at some point, like how many do program management, because I feel like it's not one of those things that you see a lot. I feel like project management would be more common, but program not so much.
I think that's right. And they, the ones that do it, maybe do it to differing degrees. Some of them look at it as something, don't want to get too far into this, but they look at it as like portfolio management, where it's almost like what products will be available at what time, and it's road mapping. So there's a schedule and there's those elements to it, but it's not exactly program management. So, it gets fuzzy in here, but I think you're right. It's different when you look at different tools.
Maybe
we can take it. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, maybe it's something we can dig into at another time. The difference between in another episode. So
if we take that question you asked though, and we flip it in the opposite direction, instead of saying, well, from basic project management, can you take it up a level, and program management, see it from a higher altitude? What if you went the other way? And all right, is there more capability around more detailed task management, something below looking at the project and the schedule and the assignments, that kind of thing? And I think there is. I think, and there's a flavor of this that comes up more, I think, in the software side when your PLM is more angled towards software, or maybe ALM systems. We talked about that on a previous episode, how is the software side, is ALM a component of PLM, or is it its own system?
We'll figure it out at some point.
I digress. Coming back to the point though, and hopefully people will know what I mean when I say this, task management, a lot of people do that in ALM systems because of how they deal with Agile, right? So in an Agile sense, if you're running an Agile project, a lot of times you won't have a schedule. You won't have dependencies necessarily between tasks, but what you need is the ability to track all the tasks, pop them up, maybe know who's taking care of them, put them into sprints, put them into a Kanban board, status them, still connect them to things. So it in a lot of ways, it's a little bit like basic project management, but I'll say it's a little different because I think it behaves differently. And some systems have it, some systems don't. And this one is also tricky because it can tie into process management, right? So when you're thinking about just managing these granular tasks, sometimes they overlap with the tasks you might have inside a standardized process. So this one can get blurry, but I think we're touching on a couple of different areas that you do and don't see in certain systems. The basic project management, going up a level to program management, coming down a level to task management.
Well, thanks. That actually makes it, even though it's blurry, it still makes it a lot clearer to kind of categorize it in that particular manner.
Gives us a framework at least.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what we're here to do, right? So if we're going beyond process management, then I think the next category we were talking about was systems engineering. So if process management is vertical, then this is more horizontal in nature.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this one is probably similarly blurry in terms of what are the lines here? What exactly are the functionalities that people are doing in systems engineering? So I'll name a handful, but that to me, this is a bleeding edge area where some things are a little more mature, but a lot of things are developing fast in terms of what capabilities you see in a PLM system or the capabilities that people are looking for in their PLM systems. So let me start with one that I think is a good kind of umbrella, but it's new, and that is model-based systems engineering, MBSE. So, what does that mean? Well, like a lot of domains inside of the digital product world, model-based is the thing that's new here. People have been doing systems engineering for years. And I'm not a systems engineer. I've got some background in it. I've done some education in that area, but I'm more mechanical. Mm-hmm. But systems engineering as a discipline has, a regimented way of doing things and approaching it. It is very horizontal, like you said, but the model-based brings something new to it that really lends itself to this digital world of PLM tools. So MBSE model management, I think, is a big capability we're seeing in this area. It's a big functionality that's being introduced. It's a little bit like CAD management. So when I'm not talking about it over in the file management category, we probably could have maybe, but because of how systems engineering works and how horizontal it is and how it needs to connect with and touch everything, I would say this MBSE model management functionality is more than just managing files, because it's about exposing what's in them to connect it to other stuff in the PLM system, right? This is real digital thread kind of stuff where a systems model often has breakdowns of structures, behaviors, activities, things like that. And all of those elements that are inside these models need to be exposed as their own records so they can get connected and linked to other things. So I put it here because I think it's a better place to talk about it and think about it, even though functionally it's got some similarities to CAD. But that's one important
No,
one.
and I can see it has some similarities with CAD. Can you, and I know we don't want to get in too deep in all of these because we've got so many to cover, but like, can you give me like a specific example of like MBSE?
Sure. So one, there's 4 pillars inside of MBSE, and I'm not going to get them all right, but one of them is structure, right? So it's a lot like product structure. But in the MBSE world, you're not thinking necessarily about the physical structure of your product. You're thinking about the structure and the breakdown of components in a functional way, in a logical way, and then maybe in a physical way. So functional breakdown of a product might be, well, it's a car. Okay, it's a car we're talking about. That's the system we're interested in. Well, there's a breakdown of, well, functionally, it needs to go places. It also needs to hold things. It needs to take passengers. So these are the functions of it. And you break those down and then start to analyze them and allocate them. And so that's the kind of work you're doing in systems engineering. Later, you're thinking about, well, logically, what do I need for that? Well, I probably need some kind of chassis. That's the get us places, and a power plant because I got to, motor us to get us there. And so then you relate that back to that functional breakdown. And then later, you're going to design all the pieces of the physical product that align with the logical architecture and the functional architecture. So it's all these structures. And you get into other pillars like activities and behaviors that connect. So I'll say it's a fuzzier description of systems and systems engineering than the maybe hardcore hardware stuff that we think of in a lot of PLM. But it's breakdowns, it's elements, it's structures, and that's the stuff that needs to be exposed.
It's interesting. It's listening to you describe that and comparing it to file management. You're right. There's a logical piece of it that fits, but it's a different view of things. Kind of like the difference between MBOM and EBOM.
Yeah, it's a different animal, right?
Yeah.
Which is why I think it was good to talk about
similarities,
here.
but a different animal.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so
we should have an episode on that.
We should. I'm gonna take some notes.
Good times.
So beyond that, requirements. That's a big piece of any sort of product lifecycle.
Yep.
Kind of the first piece, you could
for
argue.
a lot of folks, yeah. And it fits right in the systems engineering category, right? Because a lot of what happens with requirements, the systems engineering discipline helps you figure that out. If today you manage requirements, but you don't know much about systems engineering, hey, give it a look, because the systems folks have turned this into more science than art, and there's a lot here. But in PLM systems, that's certainly a functionality. Can I manage requirements and do all the kinds of behaviors around it? This one's got some similarities back to product-related structures, that broad category we talked about. Again, it's good to talk about it here because I think requirements engineering is sort of a system-specific domain. It runs across the whole product, across everything. It's very horizontal. But what you end up with is structures of requirements where you take a requirement and you break it down, and some requirements are quantitative and you need to allocate them. Like, all right, there's a weight requirement for something. The whole vehicle can't weigh more than 200 pounds. Well, that means that this subsystem gets 100 pounds. That subsystem gets 50. This one gets 30. So there's a whole process to how this works, and you need certain capabilities for it. So requirements engineering functionality is a thing that some PLM systems do, some tools do, but it's another good area to talk about inside of this broad bucket. It leads us right to the next one, right? Which, by the way, is traceability. So one of the things that you could argue that you do in requirements engineering is you take those requirements and then you connect them to other things downstream, right? You connect them to what is the physical part of the design that's going to satisfy that requirement. And we talked, remember, a couple episodes ago about one of the platform capabilities is linking.
Right.
This is, you utilize some of those things like linking to tie things together. But let me just sort of explode that out. Imagine that at an extreme level, that you're not just connecting a requirement to a part in a BOM or a part in a CAD file and saying they're linked. But I have lots of artifacts related to my product, lots of pieces of the design, information about it, and maybe regulatory requirements, customer requirements, things from my industry, lessons learned on previous projects. Got this universe of information that actually all should connect back to my product through digital thread style connections. But what I want to know is I want to trace those connections. I want to be quantitative about all those connections and understand things like coverage. All right, there's a great one. Okay, how many of my requirements are covered by a certain element of the design? Right, there's a piece of the design of my product that deals with that requirement, that addresses it. Or how about test coverage? And actually, that's another one we should come to here in a second. So maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. But I've got tests for my requirements, and I want to know how many of the requirements have a test or have enough tests to make sure that they're going to be met at some point. So this traceability concept, that's a functionality unto itself. And a lot of times it relates to integration to other systems because all the things you might need to trace might not be just inside your PLM. But so traceability as a functionality is one. And I got to go right to testing because I mentioned it and I said, maybe that's in the wrong order that I'm talking about these. Can't stop now, on a roll. So testing, an ability to record and manage tests, whether they're manual tests, whether they are virtual tests that maybe you also, you do the test itself in the PLM system, right? I've got some simulation thing that I run where I take the parameter out of the requirement. It's like, it's got to be this strong. Okay, I take that parameter, I plug it into my simulation tool, which leverages my CAD model. I run it through an optimization process. Okay, I'm tying all this stuff together, but you get the point.
But that's what PLM does.
It's what PLM does. It's true, right? That's why all these components matter, is if you need them to do what you do to make your product, you're glad if you've got all these components and can tie it together in a digital thread and automate some of what you do, right? Simplify and make it happen. But anyway, so testing is another functional area inside of the systems engineering, that broad category that I think's pretty relevant. And it ties to the others, like the traceability and the requirements.
And if you're testing anything, I imagine that it also ties into safety and some other domains there as well, right?
I think that's right. And this is where there are some other maybe niche components inside of this systems engineering area that fits for some people in PLM, right? So there's a whole area these days around model-based systems engineering and safety engineering, and how do you layer that specific domain on top of what you're already doing in systems? So, this can also touch in other areas like quality and FMEA, right? So, design, failure modes, effects analysis, PFMEA, process, failure mode, effects analysis. What could go wrong in making my product? So, lots of these. I don't know what you want to call those, methods, processes that people follow can connect back to this safety thing. And maybe safety is just one element I'm talking about that sort of represents overall. There's functionality that's niche functionality that fits in the systems engineering space that often it's a PLM component because you're not necessarily doing it with some tool like a CAD tool. You're doing it with a collection of data that only lives in a PLM system, right? So that's why I mention it here, and it looks different ways to different people, and different tools approach it other ways. But I think that's another important area of systems engineering and product architecture that we should touch on.
No, I agree. And matter of fact, it's the more we dig into this, the more obvious that this is one area. Systems engineering is one area that PLM has a lot to contribute. To your point, because it pulls together a bunch of not necessarily disparate, related, but not the same system. So,
well, disparate, I think, is a fair term based on where we are today. Not that it should be that different, but that today, all these things aren't always pulled together and connected in the way that they need to be. And systems engineering looks at that. It thinks about that. It thinks about how do you pull it all together. Or, in another way, maybe it's not pulling it together like it's at the end of the process. Systems engineering is about starting the process so it fans out into all those different areas and stays connected. But to your point, yeah, I think that's why it's becoming, we're seeing so much more of it in PLM systems, is lots of folks are recognizing the value that it brings to product development and the product lifecycle overall. And if you're in an industry where systems engineering isn't something you know well, or it's not a part of the culture of your industry, take a look at it. It may be that you actually do it, you just don't call it that, right? There are a lot of things that systems engineering, when I talk to a lot of customers about it, and they were like, well, I'm interested. Tell me more about it. The connection is they're like, oh, well, that's what our senior people do. Right. That's they have the wisdom to have that overview insight, and systems engineering is about making that not have to be through experience, but there's processes behind it.
Well, and since PLM is all about collecting and managing data and throughout the product lifecycle, those senior people, well, they're senior. They're not going to be around all of the time. And you want that institutional knowledge somewhere that you can access it once they are not there.
Absolutely. So. Yeah. You want to have it, you don't want to hold, you don't want to lose it. And you'd like to, it's ridiculous that I'm going to say these words, but you want to systematize it, right? You want to see what you can learn from how they collected that information and tied the dots together. And you want to do that in a repeatable way for other people so that when they're gone, the new generations of folks can do it.
Right. No, it's definitely a critical piece. All right. So where are we at now? We've gone through MBSC. What's next? Fringe capabilities.
How about variant management? Variant management and product line engineering. On a previous episode, we talked about this just to get this out of the way. Some people would call this configuration, product configuration, right? But I'm not talking about configuration management.
Right. You had some cautions around that, if I recall.
Exactly. Right. So not CM, not configuration management, not configurations like inside of a SolidWorks CAD tool, but variant management is what I mean. If you have a line of products, a family of products that are all very similar, but you configure them, you configure those variants. That's why I call it variant management. That's what we're talking about. The idea that, oh yeah, I could go in and plug in and say, I want a blue one that's made for the US market and it's got 8 wheels. Great. That's this specific instance of my product out of this product line. So that's the thing we're talking about. And I think there's a bunch of different functionality here that some of it works together, some of it builds on each other. So let me try and go through it in a way that builds. Okay. But just know that I think not everybody needs all these pieces, and not every system does all these pieces, and in not all cases are they well tied together, and that can be important to you as well. But the most fundamental piece you need on this is a variant dictionary, right? So you need to be able to track what you mean about how your product line or product family is going to be characterized. What are the things that vary? What are the features and options? Oh, color is a feature. Material is a feature. I like leather. I like wood. Those kinds of things. Or, maybe it's I like this kind of internal combustion engine or electric powertrain or whatever. So lots of different things could be features of your product. But being able to define that and also define the ways in which it can vary is the first step. So a variant dictionary is one piece of functionality. Building on that is variant planning and configuration. So once you know all the ingredients in your pantry that you could, build your recipes from, then you can start thinking about the recipes, right? All right, so I'll keep with the cooking analogy for a minute. In variant planning and configuration, you're thinking about, all right, well, these are the kinds of casseroles I can make. These are the kinds of main dishes I can make. So maybe those are your product families that you build up from your variant dictionary. And at this stage, you're planning those out. You're saying, well, when I make an airplane, for this kind of airplane, it's a big passenger plane, I can change things like the number of engines, the length of the wings, the length of the fuselage, the number of seats, all those kinds of things. So you're making that plan, but you're saying, look, that's in that product line. But when I make a private jet, not for commercial travel, well, it has these other options are available to it. You may still be varying characteristics like wings, seats, engines, but it's different things from your variant dictionary that are allowable, right?
Different ranges, and maybe for sure.
Also different rules perhaps too, right? Like when I do this, I have to do that. So this is the place where rules engines come into play in variant planning and configuration that say, when I sell it in the US, I can only make it red or blue, but when I sell it in Europe, I can also make it green. But then when I make it in South America, I can do yellow, but I can't do red. Those sorts of things. That's where this fits in. And it also maybe that configurator engine that lets you work through the rules to say that's a valid configuration, right? That lets you say, I picked US, now I only see red and blue. I picked blue, I got done. Great, this is the blue US one. That whole thing is part of variant planning and configuration. So those two pieces we talked about, you need so that you can do some of the other things in this area that I think are interesting.
Which
and
begs
important.
the question, what are those other things?
What are the other things, right? So first one I'll say is BOM filtering. A lot of these work on the premise that what you're doing is you're making a bill of material. First off, let's say engineering bill of material, but some of these systems will let you deal with the other bills of material too, which makes it very interesting, by the way. We won't get too deep into that, but lets you take a bill of material and overload it. People call this 150% BOM, global BOM. They have different names for it, but it's like, all right, build me a bill of material for all the possible airplanes that I could make. The ones with the 2 engines, the 4 engines, the long aisles, the big wings, the short wings, the this, the that, all the possibilities, all in one bill of material. And then we take that piece we mentioned a second ago where you could pick your features and options and get to a valid configuration. And now use those selections to filter out that 150% BOM down to exactly the product you have in mind, right? So if I pick the blue and the US and that's the one I'm making, all right, it filtered out all of the wings except for the one set of wings I want for that one. It filtered out all of the engine combinations and power and this and that, except for the ones that I'm interested in this product. So this BOM filtering capability it's a couple of things. One, it's about treating your bills of material differently sometimes. So you're not following all the typical rules of configuration management with rev control and that kind of thing. And it's about connecting it to that variant planning, that variant configuration engine that I spoke about a minute ago. So BOM filtering is about putting those two together so that you can take 150% BOM down to exactly the product you want and kind of do it dynamically on the fly.
I was just going to say, so if you're doing that for BOMs, do you do that, going a step back? Are you doing that for CAD as well then?
In some cases, and this is another capability in this area, not everybody does it. And it's hard, which is why not everybody does it. It can be hard. So if you want to filter not just a BOM structure, but you want to filter a CAD structure, well, it's tricky designing 150% CAD because now you're talking about 3D geometry and things are all on top of each other, right? If I've got all these different sizes of wings, well, they're all right on top of each other. I can't see them. So that capability, that functionality sometimes requires a very tight integration between CAD and PLM. But some systems have it so that you could do the same thing we mentioned a second ago about 150% EBOM and having it filtered by your variant plans. You could do the same thing with a CAD BOM. Build 150% structure and then have the variant configurator filter those out so that you only see the product that you want. And it lets you do other fancy things too in the design process, right? Where you can, I want to see this variant and that variant together and so you can get crazy with it. But that capability is unique. It's not the same as BOM filtering, and it's another one that's important to know about. And you can take it a step further, right? So everything we've been talking about is really sort of focuses on, I'll say, CTO, configure to order products, where it's a predefined set of options. You've got rules about how you put them together, but it's finite. Well, a lot of folks out there today, their product is not CTO, but it's ETO, engineer to order, meaning you will do it to exactly the requirements that the customer has, and you may not have all the predefined choices. It may be that you'll make it 27.5 inches long, even though standardly you got 27 and 28. But no, we'll do 27.5 for you because that's what you need. So there's another capability in this area that sometimes exists, pretty niche, but that's CAD automation. Can you take some of that rules engine we talked about earlier and the variant definition and what's allowable and all those kinds of things and feed it back to the engineering tools, the CAD tools, the simulation tools, those things that are also managed maybe by the PLM, so that you can get exactly what people want. So you can really, not have predefined choices, but have a full spectrum of choices. So this one gets deep,
still within parameters, I would imagine.
Still within parameters, right? And that's part of what you're doing is you're in your variant dictionary, you're maybe defining what's allowable. And the rules are maybe not just discrete rules of if this, then that, but they're calculations. When this gets to this size, this other thing has to have 2 supports instead of 1. So your rules can get very fancy in this area, but yeah.
So knowledge-based engineering then, KBE.
Knowledge-based engineering. It's another way of looking at it, right? And maybe we should separate that out as a different functionality in this area. But yes, absolutely, right? Beyond rules that are just if-then rules into knowledge-based engineering. And of course, now we're sort of crossing over into, well, is this really a CAD function or is this a PLM function? I don't know, right? Again, we're not trying to put everything in a discrete category, but it's an important component to think about, functionality you may or may not need.
Right. And it's all part of the product lifecycle. And,
right.
And so that's what we're managing here.
Exactly.
It's a little less about the tool and more about the system that we're talking about here. So I think if I recall correctly, going down our list, compliance and regulatory, that was our next big area.
Another good broad one. So let's talk about that. What do people need for compliance that pops up here? Why does this even exist? There's some platform stuff that deals with compliance, but there are things on top of that I think are pretty special that not every system has and not everybody needs. One is records retention. Lots of industries where safety is a big deal, they have legal requirements that are like, well, if you designed a product, you got to keep those records for X number of years because there might be a lawsuit and we need to know what you did and why you did it. That's one example of needing records retention capabilities in the system, saying like, oh, this record is 5 years old. It's time to archive it. It's time to delete it. It's time to, because not for nefarious purposes necessarily, but you don't want to have data hanging around that might be confusing and a question about, well, did you consider that or did you test this or that kind of thing? Another records retention thing is in the opposite direction. Instead of trimming things, it's keeping things alive for a long time. So those in aerospace will know what I mean when I say LOTAR, right? Long-term archiving and retrieval. So, think of 40-year-old aircraft. You have to have all the data for that. 50, 60-year-old aircraft. You have to have all the data for that. Well, that was fine when it was on paper, but now that we're all trying to be digital, that's much trickier. Can you name me a CAD format from 1984? Right? That's only 40 years ago.
CAD's 4. Yes, I can.
CAD's 4. There you go. You can name it. Now, can you run it for me?
No.
Can you pull up a file? Okay.
That's the thing. Well, that's what LOTAR is, right? I mean, it's not just the data, it's the ability to access that data.
Yep.
And
this is where that records retention functionality, I'm saying sometimes it's cutting off records and getting rid of them. Sometimes it's making sure they're still viable over time, right? Still accessible. So that's one functional area. Another one is history. This is another compliance thing, right? Can you just tell me that this data was, that the custody of this data was handled well? Like, do you know what happened to it? When was it created? Who modified it? When? Right? So you could argue this is a platform capability, right? Lots of systems can keep track of who did what to what records at what time. But I think it's worth talking about here in compliance because how many things you track about different events that happen can really be driven by what are your compliance needs. Do you need to know when somebody made it and deleted it? Is it just that simple? Or do you need to know who modified it and when? And do you need to know who downloaded it and when? That can be a big one, right? Who had access to the intellectual property? We're going to come to that one in a minute. But history is another important functional area. A lot of systems do it.
And I imagine it depends on the view of it, of the history that you're keeping relies heavily on like what you need to keep, right?
Right.
With CAD revisions, et cetera, it may be one thing, whereas, for compliance, like you said, you need to know who touched it, who had access to it, who may have, chain of custody?
Chain of custody. Exactly. That kind of thing. Yeah. Where is it? Where did it come from? Where did it go? All that stuff. I think that's right. It depends on, what your industry is a lot of times. And that's true for all these compliance things. I'll bring up another one like that. Some industries, it's okay to do digital approvals, electronic approvals of records in the product lifecycle. Say, all right, yeah, during the process, maybe an approval process, I want to record who signed off on that. But some industries have very specific requirements for that. So another one I'll put in here as a functionality is e-signature, electronic signatures. Some systems have a whole facility around this, right? Where you can do electronic signatures on your workflow processes, on approvals, or on sign-off of tasks in the project management area, as long as it is done in a certain way. And it's a combination of history and the authentication thing we mentioned on the platform. Right. So real simple one is like, FDA, a while back, it was, you need to have double challenge on your password. So I'm logged into the PLM system, I'm doing my work all day, but I get a workflow that says, hey, can you approve this drawing? If you want to approve that drawing and give it an e-signature where it's going to actually say, you have signed this, it's going to pop up and say, great. I know it's you, but what's your password again? I need to make sure it's you logged in and not that you walked away from your computer and your colleague saw it pop up and said, I'm going to prove that for him. So, e-signature is a specific functionality that a lot of people have in their systems.
Well, and I imagine that ties in a lot to intellectual property, right? Because that's a lot of times with e-signature, that's what you're trying to protect with permissions.
It is. And I think intellectual property, well, e-signatures can be for other reasons too, that you just want to know who did what for sure, right?
Right.
But to your point about intellectual property, that's another good category inside of this compliance piece is from different angles, you need to protect things, right? Not just like, oh, you should be able to edit this and I can edit that. But let's talk about just in terms of commercial business. I work with a bunch of partners. I share certain data with them each that I don't want them sharing with each other. So, an example, I'm a supplier. I work for Lockheed and I work for Boeing. I get some data from each of them into my system. Well, I need to make sure that Lockheed doesn't see Boeing's data and Boeing doesn't see Lockheed's data. And if we're all working in the same system, I have to make sure that's the case. And if I have certain NDAs, non-disclosure agreements with people, and maybe I've got customer data, but then I have suppliers who work with me who can see it, but I've got to make sure that they've got an NDA before I let them see my customer's data. And so just commercial intellectual property issues is one, but you could take this to another level. We do a lot of defense work, right? When you start doing defense work, you start to understand concepts like EAR and ITAR, export administration regulations, international trafficking in arms regulations, things where you certain countries like the US, and this is true for other countries, they have their own rules, but certain countries don't want certain kinds of weapons data or defense data to get out to other countries, whether they're friends and certain kinds of data can move around, or whether they're enemies and you don't want that data in their hands. There are all kinds of rules about this coming from ITAR and EAR, and the functionality we're talking about here for compliance with that. Boy, there's a lot I could dig into. There's a bunch of vectors of things that it needs to do, but I'll just put it under that umbrella of intellectual property protection, being able to tag the data, put rules on the data, enforce those rules, have exceptions to those rules, log things, and have history about where the rules were used. There's a lot to it, but it's a pretty specific area. And again, some systems can support it and can give you this capability, and others can't. And if you need it, you have to pay attention to that when you're thinking about your product lifecycle. Yeah,
I would think that'd be actually a very critical piece. You're right. I mean, there may be fewer industries that need to focus on that, aerospace, defense, obvious ones. But if you need to focus on it, you really need to focus on it.
Yep, agreed.
It's not something you can ignore.
All right, we ready for the next one? I know I feel like I'm getting long. I'm talking too long about this stuff, but it's good. It's in the details. It's important stuff.
It is good stuff. I am trying to keep an eye on our time and realizing we might have to do ALM in a separate section with like ALM and SPLM and all the XPLMs. Not that we want to talk about that.
That's a different thing.
That's a different thing entirely.
I'll be quicker.
Okay. Process definition.
So here's another good category: process definition, not process management. So we're talking about defining the processes around your products. So lots of people have secret sauce, special sauce, and how they make their product. I worked with one company. I'm going to tell a story. That's no good. Forget it. I won't do that. But there are lots of people who need to define how they put their product together, how they manufacture it, whether it's making the individual components or assembling them, that kind of thing. So one functionality that's important in this area is work instructions or tech illustrations. I put that under the same bucket. But this idea of it's not CAD, it's not specifying the design of the product, but it's telling you about how to put it together, how to get to meet that design, how to meet the specification with the work you do putting it together. So a lot of times people are wanting to use, 2D pictures and 3D geometry and models, reusing content that you probably have you developed in another part of your product lifecycle. So this is why it's a good component of PLM or a PLM system that you're going to reuse other content that you have. Builds out that digital thread, right? I made this CAD model over in design. I'm going to reuse it over here in illustration of my process. So this is a capability. Sometimes it's its own tool, like a CAD tool. Sometimes it's baked into a PLM system because it's leveraging so much of that existing data. Because you might be pulling into these tech illustrations or diagrams, CAD models, bill of material entries,
specifications,
specifications, documents, lots of different stuff that you kind of remixing, remastering into new content that you need for another area of your product lifecycle. So that's one functional area.
It's funny because that's another, and it's as we're getting into again the fringe areas, these are areas that like you can. It's maybe it's in your PLM system in your company, but it's not in your PLM tool. We had another episode where we really focused on 3D work instructions and how digitalization is changing the way people work, where it's integrated with the PLM system, but it's actually an entirely different application or platform itself.
Yeah, it might be its own authoring tool, right? And it's leveraging and pulling information from PLM. And so, the way you architected inside of your company to get what you need, that's a different discussion. But it's important to think about these as the components, right? And not forget that, hey, this whole broad capability, there's a lot of functional areas within it.
So work instructions are kind of like I was saying, they can be outside your PLM system, they can be inside and just integrated with it. It seems like we're crossing over a little bit area. Like when you're talking about process planning, get into like manufacturing execution systems as well.
Yeah.
Is that?
It's a great question. And I think there's another functional area of your, maybe a PLM component that you're interested in that maybe is a component of your MES if you have an MES or you want to do it in your MES instead of in your PLM. So we're at the borders maybe of what we should say a PLM system does. But I think, a lot of systems do it, and there's logic to doing it in an integrated way with your other PLM data. But that functionality we're kind of dancing around, or I'm dancing around, is work planning, which is maybe manufacturing process planning, maybe it's maintenance process planning, maybe some people would call that MRO, maintenance, repair, and overhaul. But any kind of planning you're doing for work that you're going to do to maybe make the product in the first place or maintain or repair the product later in its life. But that functionality, oh man, this is a pretty big area. It's important, really important, particularly in large complex products that you need to plan this stuff out and define it. And you have to think about things like, well, how will I use it? Where will it be used? And it's going to leverage, hopefully, a lot of other product data that's been generated already, which is why it makes sense to be part of PLM or connected back to the PLM data. So maybe you're using the CAD models for illustrations of your process steps. Maybe you're using one or more bills of material because to get through the process plan, you need to consume all of the parts in that area of the manufacturing BOM, right, that you have, so that all right, I didn't leave any bolts out. That's bad. So it's
as we've seen.
So you may need other digital resources, but again, it's a good example of how PLM connects to this whole model-based enterprise notion, right? Because down in these other parts of the enterprise, manufacturing, quality, maintenance, repair, other places where you need to plan out steps, that's part of your life cycle. If you can reuse models from other parts of your steps, that's making you a model-based enterprise because you're sharing models across the work that you do related to your product. And of course, PLM systems are an enabler for that because they help you share and manage those models all across the different steps you need. So I could get into a whole thing. I'll stop. That's another functional area though, planning, work planning, right? And it's within this process planning area.
So we've got work instructions, we've got process planning. Quality is something you got to worry about as well. Yeah. I imagine that's probably another whole section of planning.
And it's another area that can be fuzzy because maybe your kind of quality planning is right in line with your manufacturing planning. I assemble a thing, I check a thing. I assemble a thing, I measure a thing. So your kind of quality planning may be like that, or you maybe it's a different element of quality that you're looking at, which is like supplier quality planning. Oh, I want to layer on top of my product definition or definition of a component the critical characteristics I need to check when I receive it from a partner, from a supplier, or something like that. I need to know my PPAP, production part approval process. We might be right back into process management with that, but here in process planning with what are the steps I do to do it? How do I measure it? And this could also lead to other types of files that I might need to manage back in the file management piece, right? Like CMM, coordinate measuring machine. Oh, I want to program that thing to measure these, to take these steps. It can all be interwoven, right? But the point is, this is another element that you might have or need in process planning, the processes around the definition of your product.
Right. And it definitely makes sense that the more we dig into this, the more PLM itself makes sense. As far as managing all of that data, all of those processes throughout the entire life cycle.
And this is why people talk about getting efficiencies out of PLM, right? Because instead of having all these little pieces of data disconnected in all these different systems and tools and silos and organizations within your bigger business, you try and put it all in one place and share it, reuse it, right? And that's going to be much more efficient when you kind of connect it all instead of having it in all these different locations.
Well, and hopefully that's what our listeners are getting here too, is like, okay, well, we only do these 5 main areas. I didn't know that PLM could, I need to explore that with my tool. You know what? We do some of those things outside PLM. Would it be more efficient to pull that in? So,
right.
Hopefully
why do we do it in a different place? Why couldn't we do it here? Why wouldn't we connect it? Yep.
Right. And maybe it was just that they didn't realize.
So let's tie that into our last one, right? We're almost at the end of our categories. A very logical one here is hardware and software. Lots of companies today have complex products that have both.
Mm-hmm.
But software traditionally maybe has been dealt with as a separate thing. Oh, the software people do their thing. The hardware people do their thing. But PLM systems today, we're starting to see expansion into this area of what is traditionally ALM, Application Lifecycle Management. So we're talking about that one like it's a broad PLM category. Well, maybe it is just what an ALM does, but let's talk about it as if it's a PLM component, because your product as hardware and software, part of its life is both those pieces. How does it all come together? So I think, we should also clear up ALM, like we said, Application Lifecycle Management, not ALM Asset Lifecycle Management, because that ALM could relate to MRO. And anyway, that's a different topic. Sorry, not to get us off track when we're already running long. But so what are some of the things that are in this ALM space? I'm going to go back to our other broad categories and kind of sprinkle them in, right? So one is file management. We mentioned source code control back in file management as a capability. That's something that a lot of traditional ALM systems will do. So that's a piece, right, here or over in file management. How about doc management? There's another piece inside of file management. Traditional ALM, software development, you had specs, tech specs, functional specs, requirements, things that drove what you did in software. That's another piece that you might need here or might need to relate. There was also a focus, it should be, on project management. If you've got project management for hardware, you also have project management for large software product development cycles. But again, those may be more agile, but they may relate back to what we talked about in that broad project management category of either Gantt chart, waterfall type, or agile, Scrum, Kanban type, but you need that to keep track of the product and what you do. Another piece that relates these days, really important, software bombs. All right, today's software incorporates a lot of code from a lot of places, not all the things that you wrote, but you need to know what you got from whom, particularly if you have compliance issues around, well, what's the source of that? How is it checked for security, that kind of thing. And then we touched on this too when we were talking about systems engineering and product architecture. Well, the software world's been doing that maybe for longer than the hardware world in certain industries.
Without a doubt.
Right? Thinking about breakdowns, behaviors, state machines, how it ties back to requirements, all those kinds of things. So there are lots of pieces that I would say, if you talked about what's in an ALM, you name these things, but they relate right to other PLM components. And there's sort of specializations that we want to think about. There's one that's unique, though, that I want to make sure we're touching on. I don't know that there's a lot of PLM systems out there today that do it, but when you think about your broader PLM system inside your company, you should think about this component. And that is hardware gets manufactured in a very specific way because it's physical. There's a physical instance of it. And you can put your hands on the things and put them together. With software, manufacturing isn't that at all. But the manufacturing analog is I still have things to do from the raw definition of my software product, right? The source code, the specs. I have steps I have to take to turn that into the software that runs on the end device, the executables, right? And those steps, there are some analogs, some places it breaks apart, but I have to build or compile the software. I have to put the various pieces together. I have to deploy them. I have to test them, right? Like quality in manufacturing. Are they talking to each other? Are they working? Are there bugs? Does it die? Does it memory overflow? Those kinds of things. So there are steps to the software build process that there's functionality in some systems, sometimes ALM, some PLMs might be edging into this, but I'll call it DevSecOps. That's the term that I see that's popular today, right? Which is development into security, into operations. How do you make that all flow? And connecting all of that so it can be automated, ties back to our process management topic, process automation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you make all those steps happen? But this is another area that I think people should look at when they think, hey, does my PLM system have all the right components? That might be a component that you need if you've got a lot of software in your product. So I'll stop there. We could spend a whole episode on ALM, but that maybe hits the high points.
And maybe we should.
Maybe we should.
But you're right. I mean, it's, we've been here a while today. And this is the third of 3 episodes. So, kudos to all of our listeners that have stayed the course with us.
If you've made it through.
We have covered a lot, and we've gotten not just breadth, but we've really, doing it in 3 episodes, we've covered a lot of depth as well. So you want to walk us through the top categories?
Yeah. Let's just kind of back in that, get to the 50,000 foot view and kind of scan through it again, right? So we talked about in PLM systems, the broad categories, or some of the main ones, the basics are platform capabilities, right? Around security, user management, those kinds of things. File management capabilities, which gets us into doc management, CAD, simulation, all kinds of files. Right. Process management for business processes, the most common are like engineering processes, like engineering change and release, but other kinds of business processes we might run. Product structure related management, all kinds of bills of material, product information management, those kinds of things. And then collaboration, right? Collaboration with file viewing, markup, selected publication, those kinds of things. Those were the basics, the big 5 or so that we said. And then we got into the fringier ones, right? Which is where we spent a lot of time in this episode talking about things like project management, right? Which is different from process management. Systems engineering and product architecture, that's another one. Another one is variant management, or some people call that product line engineering. We talked about compliance and the specific functionality there. We talked about process planning. So processes around the product, not process management, but the processes of building a product, of repairing, maintaining it, that kind of thing. And then we talked a little bit about ALM, right? And is application lifecycle management its own thing, or it's just an element of PLM? And so we kind of talked about it like it might be a component of PLM or a specialization of it. So I think that's it, right? I mean, that was our whirlwind tour
for this point in time.
At this point in time, of the components, right? The main areas and main components of PLM systems.
Right. And hopefully that's, like I was saying earlier, hopefully that's given everyone an introduction to the wide breadth of capabilities that are in PLMs, commonly in PLM systems, sometimes uncommonly in PLM systems. It's areas that you can, if you're implementing a PLM system, if you've already got it running there, these are other areas that you can explore and look into. If you're doing these things in other areas of your business, maybe you need to be looking at doing it, connecting it in with your PLM system in one way or another.
Right. So thinking about holistic digital products, right? Not just in a certain silo or domain.
Yeah. Silos are bad. Silos are very bad. All right. Now, after all of that, if we have missed anything, if you have questions about anything that we talked about or didn't talk about, please reach out. We would love to hear from you. And anybody that's listened for all 3 episodes, maybe we should offer some sort of award or prize, or, so if you have made it through all 3, if you have made it to all 3, reach out and let us know, because I will be impressed, and maybe we can get some incentives going.
And you're my kind of person. I want to know. I want to know if you think this stuff is that cool.
It's a unique kind of person. I'll give you that. So
thank you for putting that so politely, Jen.
Please feel free to reach out to us, to subscribe on your favorite platform. And until next time, stay sharp.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. We appreciate you. If you have any questions for our podcast team or have an idea for a new topic for our team to cover this year, please send an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We would love to hear from you. Also, leave a comment on our post and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, stay sharp.